Let's talk a little bit more about Indian swords and hilt size. Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. So I've dealt with the subject of Indian swords and Indian weapons in general in many of my previous videos, and I have spoken in the past about hilt size. And one of the assertions that I have made is that where lots of people have assumed that one of the reasons that a lot of tulwar hilts are very small and confined on the hand is to do with the size of the hands involved. So when they're talking about, for example, comparing 19th century average Indian people to 21st century Western or even 21st century Indian people, and we are for the most part larger than 19th century Indian people were, and you can verify this archaeologically, but an even easier way is to go to photographs, and luckily we have lots of Victorian photographs of soldiers and civilians in India in the 19th century, and it's very clear to see that the average size of soldiers and the population in general in India in the 19th century was smaller than it is today, and of course smaller for the most part than people from other areas in that period as well. Why was this? Well, quite simply, diet is the biggest answer. The general populace in India in the 19th century didn't have a very high level of nutrition, didn't get a lot of food, and didn't get a lot of meat, and so generally speaking they were on the smaller side. But moving on from that point, does that mean that hilts would naturally be smaller? Well, first of all, are hilts smaller? The first thing to say is yes, anybody who collects antique swords like this tulwar I'm holding here will note that many tulwars are really confined on the hand, and this one up here on the wall is known, I don't know if you can see it on there we go, this one is not Matt's tulwar, that's Lucy's tulwar, isn't it, Lucy?
Yes.
And the reason for that is because Matt cannot fit his hand into Lucy's tulwar. But Lucy can fit her hand perfectly comfortably into it. Now, Lucy, for the record, is 5'10", so she is not small, but she has a woman's hands, and I have a man's hands. And for the most part, her hands are more slender than mine, and so they fit into the hilt of this tulwar, whereas mine don't. In fact, I'll just demonstrate that point. Can I even physically imagine a situation where I've been disarmed of my sabre or whatever I've got, and yeah, there's a tulwar lying on the ground. I'll grab that tulwar and defend myself with it. Damn it! I can't get my hand into it. And there are many antique tulwars that are exactly like this. There's only one way. If you literally can't squeeze, I literally cannot squeeze my hand into that. If you can't do that, Lucy's just laughing at this point. If you can't squeeze your hand into a tulwar hilt, the only real option is to either have your little finger sticking off one end or your index finger sticking off the other end. Well, you can't really, in this case with a tulwar, leave the little finger off the end because you have a disc pommel, and with a disc pommel that doesn't allow you to do that. With something like a Viking era sword or another type of sword with a confined hilt, you might be able to do that. Not with this one. Just remember, this is really sharp, this tulwar, so I'll hold it a bit more carefully. So your only option really is to slip the bottom three fingers in and put your index finger over the guard, and now lo and behold I can hold and operate the tulwar. And in fact there are images from Indian art, and you see it similarly in Middle Eastern art as well with other types of sword, with the index finger over the quillon or guard. So it wasn't only done with European swords, it was most famously in the Renaissance. You do occasionally see it in Asian and Middle Eastern art as well. But for the most part, tulwars often have hilts which are on the small side for a modern Western hand, and I would say even for a modern Indian hand as well, because Indian people, the average height in India has increased a lot in recent decades due to changing diets, improving health and nutrition and everything else. But when I get a tulwar like this one, which has a really nice big roomy hilt, I keep it because they're not that easy to come by. There's another one on the wall behind me here, this one without a knuckle bow, and equally this has a pretty big hilt as well. But I think it is true, it is correct to say that generally speaking, tulwars do have small hilts. Now you might think, so I've said in the past it's not only to do with hand size, I've said it's to do with the way that a tulwar is intended to be used and held. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, as I've explained before, the big disc pommel is there not only as a stylistic thing, but to enforce a certain style of cutting. We know this because it's explicitly stated in 19th century descriptive accounts, but also if you just swing a tulwar around for a while, you'll very quickly realise that this is how a tulwar is supposed to be used. And that is when you're holding it, you don't, as you would do with most Western sabres, let the blade extend out from the forearm, because if you do that, the disc sticks into the underneath of your hand here in a rather uncomfortable way, and it just doesn't work. It doesn't feel right. Whereas on the other hand, if you keep this angle closer to 90 degrees here and draw cut or push cut in this way, then you don't have any problem. So the disc is really there to encourage and to some degree enforce a certain style of draw cutting. And we know absolutely, as I said before, from numerous historical sources from the period, that the draw cut was what Indian swordsmen were famous for. So I have made the point myself in the past, and other people have made similar points, that the tulwar hilt is not small because of a smaller hand, but small to enforce this style of draw cutting. However, there is a very good point that goes contrary to that, and that is other Indian swords and other Indian weapons. And the fact is that there are other weapons which also tell us something about hand size, where the draw cutting is not so much, or is not exactly the same. We don't have the disc pommel, so we don't have the same sort of conditions there to force us to do that style of draw cutting. The perhaps weakest example I can show is this, what some people will call a Kandar hilt, although I personally would say the Kandar is a type of blade. This is a, actually it's a Farangi, which would be Frankish or foreign or European style blade. So essentially it's the same style saber blades that they were using in Poland, for example, on Polish sabers. Made in Germany, exported all over the world. Thousands of them were imported into India, and they were mounted on local hilts. This is what I would call, and what 19th century authors sometimes called, a Hindu basket hilt. Sometimes they have this stalk extension at the end, which is used probably predominantly so that you can, if you want to, turn it into a two-handed weapon momentarily. But sometimes they don't have that stalk. But the important part is they have this big style shell guard up here, and usually a knuckle bow. In fact, this is a style of hilt which goes back into the medieval period without the knuckle bow. So if you want to know what a 14th or 15th century Indian sword looked like, generally speaking they were straight, double-edged, sometimes single-edged, but double-edged usually, and they had a style of guard that looked like this upper part here, and a pommel that looked like this, but they didn't have this until about the 17th century. So the knuckle, much like in Europe, the guard got more enclosed in the sort of 16th, 17th century period, and very often stayed that way after that period. But going back to the whole point of the video, the fact is that despite the fact that this is an entirely different style of hilt, and although it has a disc pommel, it's not a flat disc pommel, it's it's a hemispherical pommel, and actually very comfortable to hold, they are nevertheless a tight fit on the hand, and in fact even tighter fit than this implies, because these usually have a padded liner inside, which obviously this has perished, it's rotted away or dropped off or whatever, but usually it's leather and then with something like velvet or some other type of fancy soft fabric, silk or whatever. So you put your hand in here and it's cushioned all around, much like a Highland basket hilt in some ways, but that of course makes the aperture or opening for the hand even smaller. So as you can see, I can only just really fit my hand into this so-called Hindu basket hilt or Indian basket hilt, and that also therefore implies that even with this style of sword, which were probably used very differently, the style of the pommel suggests they are extending the blade out and not keeping that right angle as they would do with a tulwar. Even with this style of sword, probably used in a different way, different style of blade, blah, 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 and different style of hilt, there's still a very confined hilt. And that's the weakest example. The next example I'm going to use is the dand pata. Okay, I've shown this in previous videos, and it's one of these. That's right, it's one of those swords like what is used in Willow. I think it's the only Western movie that you'll see these ever used in. But essentially, it's again a German-made blade. This one doesn't have markings on it, but a lot of them have Solingen German makers marks on. And it's the same type of blade that in Europe would have been mounted on a cavalry broadsword or palash, and they were traded out to India. India bought lots of German blades, and they mounted them onto this gauntlet. Now, if you watch Forged in Fire, you may have seen them make some horrible reconstructions of this thing. But anyway, it's quite an interesting weapon. I'm not going to talk too much about it because I've talked about it before, and I'll do a more dedicated video about this in the future. But clearly they have an opening for the hand. Now, just like the basket hilt here, this was fitted with a padded and fabric liner. So was this. So in fact, I can just weasel my hand with some discomfort. Just there we go. I can just about get my hand in there. Now, I'm relatively skinny and I've got relatively slim hands. Many of my friends who try and put this on cannot get their hands in there. My hands are just slim enough that I can manage it. And as you can see, it is an incredibly tight fit. Literally, if it was perhaps 2 or 3 millimeters narrower, I wouldn't be able to get my hand in there at all. And bear in mind, this is not in its original condition. In its original condition, oh God, let's try and get my hand out. Oh, this is how tight this is. There we go, got my hand out. In its original condition, it would have a liner with padding in here, so it would be even smaller inside, in fact. So therefore, both the basket hilt and the dand putter here, both are definitely made for small-ish hands, regardless of the fact of how these weapons are used. Clearly this is not used like a tulwar, and clearly this is not really used like a tulwar. So in both those cases, they are genuinely small hilts. They're not just made small for the style of swordsmanship. The final example I'm going to use is the katar or punch dagger, and I have one here. And much like tulwars, these are something you find if you're dealing in antiques or collecting antiques. This is a particularly nice example, incidentally, with a Wootz patterned blade. I can just see the pattern in there. It's a really lovely piece. Another one of those things that I bought with the intention of selling it and then decided not to. It's got remainder of some Koftgari decoration on, which is essentially silver, or I think it might be gold in this case, actually, kind of applied leaf decoration. But in the case of katars, again, it's extremely unusual to find a katar like this that, as a fully grown male living in the Western world, you can fit your hand into. Now this one, I can just about squeeze my fingers into. You'll see it's a real squeeze, and in actual fact, if I want to be comfortable, and this is my top tip of the day, if you want to be comfortable holding your katar, then take your little finger, get it out and put it on the outside. So you've actually only got 3 fingers in between those bars, but they are intended to be used with all the fingers between these bars. And again, much like tulwars, you can buy many of these things and you'll find that only about 10% of them you'll be able to, if you're an adult male, unless you've got really small hands, only about 10% of them will you be able to get your hand into. And clearly these don't have to be extremely tight to the hand. You want them to be somewhat tight to the hand so that they don't kind of wobble around. But to be honest, once you're gripping it in your fist, even if you've got some lateral space this way, it should be fairly sturdy. And the fact that you've got 2 bars in here is what keeps it in a straight line and doesn't allow it to, kind of revolve around. So in this case, clearly it's not used like a tulwar. It doesn't have a disc pommel. You're probably not draw cutting with it most of the time. You're mostly just punching or stabbing with it, and it's uncomfortable for me to use that because my hand is too big for it, despite the fact that this is a high status, very high quality made object with a Wootz or Damascus blade. So there we have it. Fundamentally, we've got a whole range of different types of Indian swords where they've got relatively small hilts. So I think we have to, unfortunately, Much though I like to try and debunk some of the common explanations for things in weapons and military history, to a certain extent we can't deny the common explanation for why hilts on Indian swords are small. We have to say, undoubtedly, because small hilts go across Indian weapons of the 19th and earlier centuries, whether it's talwars or basket hilts or dandpatas or katars or various other types of kanda or various other types of Indian sword, because so many of them do have small hilts, and many of them, it either makes it impossible for them to use if you've got a hand of the size of mine, and many of my male friends have bigger hands than I do. I don't have particularly big hands. They're not small, but I'd say they're about average for my height. I'm just over 6 foot. I think we have to make the conclusion that yes, indeed, many Indian swords were made for people with smaller hands than most adult males have today. So really, to finish on that bombshell, it's not really a bombshell at all. It's actually to say that whilst we may like sometimes to try and find other alternative explanations that aren't necessarily the easy explanation for why a weapon is designed a certain way, sometimes, and this is an example, sometimes the easy and obvious explanation is indeed the correct one. And I think in this case, that is probably the main explanation for why so many Indian swords have such small hilts, is because your average 19th century Indian swordsman had a smaller hand than I do. Cheers, folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.